morning and welcome to the Public Affairs Forum at the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Our Public Affairs Forum is free and open to the public and occurs most Sundays at noon. Please check the website austinuu.org for more information. Today I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Michael Tobis, who will be our speaker. He has recently retired from a career as a geophysicist studying climate physics and is moving into a writing and speaking about climate and sustainability. Michael started out as an engineering student but was drawn to applying engineering skills to large problems with social importance, as climate change certainly is. He received a doctorate from the University of Wisconsin at Madison in 1996 for a novel approach to ocean models. He has held appointments at the Argonne National Laboratory, the University of Chicago, and the University of Texas. He is the founder and editor of Planet3.org's sustainability news website and is currently working on a book about ways to remove carbon dioxide from the environment. And please welcome Dr. Michael Tobis.
All right. This is not entirely a happy talk. I have a friend who calls me Dr. Doom. So, but I'll try to be constructive, just the same. What got me interested in this was actually a question not about the atmosphere, but about society. I was one of the first people to come into climatology because of policy interests rather than being a weather nerd. And I was interested in the question of how society deals with complex issues. And, you know, how does information get from science into the public, into the political sector? How do decisions get made? And I think the answer that's come clear through studying climate is that we don't really know. We don't have a sensible way of approaching how complicated information gets translated into vigorous, meaningful policy. So my talk is inspired by two recent books that just came out, both with dark, gloomy covers, that essentially are bemoaning the fact that we are really behind the curve in dealing with climate. We really ought to have been, based on the information that we had, been dealing with this on a global level a lot more vigorously than we have been for at least 20 years. And so things are sort of darker than you would expect, gloomier than you would expect if you had come in 20 years ago. And so the question is why first, and then what can we do about it? So I'm going to divide the talk basically into two parts. First, I'm going to review the material for, usually at these sorts of talks you're preaching to the choir, but still just to update everyone on what the basics of the situation are, and maybe that will touch off some Q&A at the end. So this is what if the press had been doing their job, most people would already know. First of all, and I hope you already know this, is we are changing the atmosphere. This is a graph of carbon dioxide versus time that's been collected continuously on top of a mountain in Hawaii. And you see the carbon dioxide going up pretty much on a regular basis with a little annual cycle riding on top. As plants grow, most of the land is in the northern hemisphere. As plants grow during the summer, they draw down the carbon dioxide. As they decay in the fall, the carbon dioxide goes up a little, and that's that wiggle that lies on top of the curve. We also have records going back many, many thousands of years, and there has never been in the record anything as rapid as this. The carbon dioxide has gone up and down over time, but nothing like this. I'm going to proceed to the most complicated of the technical slides, so don't panic. I'm not going to ask you to understand everything on here. But this is really the stories. Why that matters is that we essentially have an energy budget. Energy is conserved in the physicist sense, not because we turn down our air conditioners, but because what comes in must go out. energy is a thing in the universe that never gets created or destroyed for our practical purposes. And so the amount of energy coming into the Earth and the amount of energy leaving the Earth are the same. They have to be. They always have to be. And this is a picture of the budget, of how energy comes into the Earth and how energy leaves the Earth. And the main thing I want you to look at is that thing on the right, which is how surface radiation going up and radiation from the atmosphere coming down are the way the atmosphere and the Earth exchange energy. And so if you change the greenhouse gases, if you change the amount of greenhouse gases, that part of the picture changes. And then everything else is out of balance. So the system has to change to get back into balance because energy cannot pile up. It's not a thing that energy does. So the system has to find some other way of operating as soon as you change any of the pieces here, and we are changing one of them. And so the climate can't stay the same. If you suddenly increase the greenhouse gases, which we are doing, that means more energy will come in than goes out unless the climate changes. So the first thing the climate wants to do is warm up. And in any case, even if it finds some other way to adjust, something has to give. You don't have a balance anymore. And the climate is going to be different. And many other things change as a consequence of that. And sure enough, this is the infamous hockey stick. People criticize it a lot. But in fact, every subsequent study since 1998 has showed roughly the same picture of very slight decrease in global temperature for the last 1,000 years until about the turn of the 20th century and suddenly shooting back up. And so what you would expect from a first cut look at the physical situation is in fact what you see. You see the temperature going up. The other thing that I think the press is not doing a good job of communicating to people is that carbon dioxide adds up. It's like water going into a bathtub. If the drain is stopped and you add water, the bathtub keeps filling up. There's no... the ways in which carbon dioxide are removed from the atmosphere, the way the natural equilibrium is formed, is very slow. Carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere is a geological process. It takes 1 million years or so for it to go away. And we're adding it in on a decade by decade basis, so that we're essentially filling up a bathtub that has a tiny little drain. And for practical purposes, the drain doesn't exist, and we keep adding carbon. So every little piece of carbon you add, even if you cut back, every little piece of carbon, anything you burn that's fossil is adding to the amount of carbon in the system. And so essentially, like diamonds being forever, and diamonds are carbon, actually carbon is forever. If you dig it up out of the mineral state and put it into the atmosphere and the ocean, it's going to stay swirling around for far, far longer than human beings have ever existed in this world. Unless we find some way to take it out, but that's another story. And then what happens? Well, it matters. The thing that matters to us here most, the thing that we talk about most in Austin, is it getting drier? And there's a lot of reasons to think that it will. It's a fairly complicated story, but there's a lot of reasons to expect the subtropical desert to expand northward in the northern hemisphere, southward in the southern hemisphere, dry out Texas, dry out the Mediterranean, dry out Arizona, dry out Argentina, dry out Australia. So the places that are already on the verge of being dry will get drier. Also, more of the precipitation comes in intense events. You get more floods. And probably the biggest thing for the whole world is sea level rise. A lot of people live in coastal plains, and those coastal areas are going to get inundated. People who live on islands, people who live in low-lying countries like Bangladesh are going to have nowhere to go. They're not going to be citizens of any place that's not underwater. So essentially, the biggest risk probably in the foreseeable future is a huge refugee crisis from places that were at sea level. And also the carbon dioxide directly causes it to be harder for corals to form and shellfish to form. And so that's damaging the ecology directly without going through climate at all. It's causing declines in the ocean, which is already under all sorts of other threats. And then there's things that we scientists didn't think of. And so the one we're seeing recently that nobody expected was these stuck weather patterns, which right now is causing a tremendous drought in California. A few years ago, in 2011, caused a tremendous drought here. You may remember the forest fires in Russia and the floods in Pakistan a few years ago. That was a similar pattern where the weather just got stuck. In some places which would normally get some rain would not get any rain. In some places which would normally the rain would stop would just keep raining and raining and raining and raining. Nobody saw this coming. People are working on it. People are starting to come up with theories as to why it's happening. We don't know if it's permanent. This is all sort of surprising. But it does seem to be a change that we're seeing. And to continue cheering you up, there are food security risks, there are water supply risks, displacement, migration, ecological disruption. I guess I alluded to all of those things. And it's not in the future anymore. Everybody who was here 3 years ago will remember this scene. And so you can't say, okay, the Bastrop fire was caused by climate change. But on the other hand, it was a very, very strange summer. It was a real outlier, and it fits in with the patterns of what we're seeing. So although a scientist is reluctant to say, okay, yeah, that's climate change, it's the sort of thing that we're seeing a lot more of. And there are other reasons that ecosystems are under stress, and those are also our fault, and it also ties into how we deal with things. But we're no longer talking about something entirely hypothetical. Are you done? Are you had enough bad news? Okay, this is the worst news of all, and people don't seem to get it, which is that you ain't seen nothing yet. What you're seeing now is, everything else I've said up till now is pretty solid science. This, you could see it's fuzzy. We don't know how bad it's going to be. There are two things that determine how that curve is going to go. One is whether the science is too alarmist or too complacent, and we don't really know that. And the other is what human beings actually do. If we stop emitting carbon, that curve is likely to come down. If we keep going, that curve is likely to go up. So in this picture, you've seen some scientific uncertainty, and you're also seeing uncertainty about what human beings are actually going to do. So we don't know what it's going to be, but even in the best case, even in the happiest outcome, you ain't seen nothing yet. The stuff you're seeing now is smaller than we're going to see, even if we do a really good job of coping with the situation. We cannot turn this off overnight. It's going to keep going for a long time. And the other thing to notice is that this graph cuts off in 2100. Hopefully time does not end at that point. Do you see any sign of that leveling out? Well, maybe some of these curves level out a little bit. But how far it could go, we have enough coal and oil and these new tar sands, natural gas. We have enough there to make the world into a dramatically altered and damaged place. And the world has been colder and hotter, but it doesn't go through changes this rapid in nature. And so we have the capacity to do some tremendous damage. Okay, here finally a little good news. There are things we can do. We can change our behavior, and we can change how we get our energy, and we can find relationships to nature that are closer. And to be honest, I put the atomic symbol there. We could think about nuclear power. A lot of people are opposed to that who are most engaged in this. There's historical reasons for that. If you talk to climate scientists, they tend to be pro-nuclear. So there's really no time to lose to bend that curve down. Here's another picture, which basically these are three scenarios of humans really stepping up to the plate and preventing the global temperature for growing up more than 2 degrees Celsius, which is 3.5 Fahrenheit. And this is kind of the best we can do. And these three curves have the same result. And so if emissions peak in 2011 and start going down, you have a much smoother path than if you wait until 2020 for them to go down. So in the case of stopping immediately, you have to reduce your emissions 3.7% per year. If you wait until 2020, it's 9% per year. It becomes much, much, much more difficult. And there's no sign of this happening, let's be honest. So this is a fairly complicated idea. I wish the press would do a better job of conveying it. They don't. But basically, the point here is that although the consequences are far in the future, what we do now has a tremendous impact on how it turns out. So, we know what to do. And we don't do it. And why is that? So that's the meat of the talk. This is you should have heard most of that stuff already, although I realize getting it all at once is not great fun. So what ought to have happened? Science perceived a meaningful risk in the 70s and 80s. There was a big meeting at Kyoto in the 90s. Journalism should have explained the science to the people. The people should have put enough pressure on the governments. The governments should have signed a treaty. The treaty should have taken effect. And we would have been a lot better off if we had done in the 90s what we said we would do. Because as I pointed out, those curves, it really matters how soon you start. And this didn't actually happen. It did happen with the ozone hole and CFCs. So something very much like this did happen. There was enough political pressure, there was enough of a treaty that CFC emissions essentially were terminated. And the ozone hole has stopped getting worse. And there's a slight hint of it getting better, but it stopped getting worse in the 80s. So we knew what to do, and we thought, well, we'll just repeat that experience. And that's not what happened. So why not? Well, the first reason is because the fossil fuel industries, mostly coal and oil, had a lot to lose. Right? We're basically saying, okay, all your reserves, we don't want you to touch them. We want you to get into some other business. Maybe you can sell popcorn or something. They don't like that. So what's happened is that two groups of people, ideological libertarians and some of the people, not all of the people, but some of the people in the fossil fuel industry got together to start presenting an alternative story to the one that I've told you. And that story is, it's at best delusional. In some cases it's dishonest. There's some people, I think, are literally making things up without regard to whether they're true or not. But I think a lot of these people are just fooling themselves that these things are not exactly, that the story they're telling themselves about me being a bad guy up here with some intention of fooling you makes some sense. Another problem, and there's a lot of words on this slide, but basically is that scientists don't actually like to get up on stage. I mean, I'm sort of the exception. I love attention. Scientists like to talk to other scientists in opaque ways. It's actually my hero, Norbert Wiener, but that's a whole other story. So I want to give you a couple of quotes. One is from Jim Hansen, who suggested that a fellow named Mercer suggested that global warming could lead to disastrous disintegration of the West Antarctic ice sheet in the 1970s. And Hansen says, I noticed that scientists who disputed Mercer, suggesting his paper was alarmist, were treated as being more authoritative. It was not obvious who was right on the science, but it seemed to me, and I believe to most scientists, that the scientists preaching caution and downplaying the dangers of climate change fared better in receipt of research funding. And one of the things they accused us of is saying this because we want funding. But I've been out there, and really the guys who stick their necks out are not the guys who get the money. It's the guys who keep their nose to the grindstone and don't talk and don't make waves that get the funding. Similarly, Kevin Trenberth. Kevin's a wonderful man. I know him a little bit. Often, other scientists do not give you kudos for being quoted in the media, and it's easy to get misquoted and create a negative impression. So the press will get it wrong every time. Anybody who's been interviewed knows this. And that's an embarrassment for the scientist because he's quoted as saying something silly, because it was taken out of context, or because the quote was just totally wrong. And he also said, engaging with the public has influenced what I spend time on. A lot of my time might be considered wasted. It means I'm not doing other things or I'm working longer hours. My funding has been adversely affected. So, in fact, the claims that this is self-motivated on the parts of the scientists is not true. Scientists are motivated to shut up Then there's the press. And the American press likes to play the middle. This fellow in the corner is a guy named Jay Rosen. He's a professor of journalism at NYU. I just love reading his stuff. He's absolutely brilliant at finding how journalism doesn't serve the American public by virtue of refusing to take sides, refusing to make a decision. Basically, it says, the view from nowhere is a bid for trust that advertises the viewlessness of the news producer. Frequently, it places the journalist between polarized extremes and calls the neither nor position impartial. Well, sometimes one side is right and one side is wrong. And the journalist will present it as, well, there are two sides to this question. It's a defense against charges of bias, and it's an attempt to secure a kind of legitimacy. And he also says, journalism is dumber than the journalists who often share the sense of absurdity. But if you actually go to the mainstream press, and people on either side of any serious issue will complain about this, they just don't ever validate who's right and who's wrong. My friend Gardner Selby in PolitiFact, Texas, a notable exception. He promoted the talk, so thanks, Gardner, wherever you are. There's also the psychological aspect of it, which is when people get riled up, they're usually somebody they're mad at. Right? There's Bill McKibben is trying to pull together a massive march in New York weekend after next. And there's some question as to how he'll get that march. I mean, Martin Luther King or Gandhi or these people motivating the really successful groundswells of political change always had someone they were objecting to. And the biggest problem we have is that we're objecting to ourselves. There's really nobody who's innocent here. We're all doing some of this. So there's no identifiable enemies. There's no abruptness on a human time scale. To the geological system, to the Earth, it's very, very rapid. But to a human being, it happens over the course of generations. It's very hard to feel. It's not really particularly worse from one day to the next. And so we don't feel the urgency that's actually there. If you engage, you're looking for issues that make you offended. Yeah, I'm a little offended by really large vehicles, but there are other things that offend me more. There's serious injustice in the world every day. We hear about it. And our attention is drawn to those things. And the other thing is that, so those were listed by Daniel Gilbert. Kahneman, is it Daniel Kahneman? Another Daniel also added that we tend to be more engaged when there's less controversy among the people we trust. And this brings us back to the Merchants of Doubt, who are doing a very good job of injecting controversy into this all. Another problem. Are you done? Have we had enough problems? There's another one, which is if we do the right thing, if we stop emitting carbon, the costs are immediate, and the benefits are intangible and in the future. All we'll do is avoid a crisis that we find hard to imagine in the first place. And it's very hard for a politician the reason I picked Reagan and Carter to represent the politicians is because Reagan won that election on the basis of one quip, which was, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Well, if we take the carbon thing seriously, we will be worse off in 4 years. We will be better off in 400 years. That's really hard for a politician to solve. Then you get everyone in a room. I mean, basically, we have to have a global agreement in order to actually have commitments at each national level. And you get 190-some different sovereignties in a room with their representation. This is an actual picture of the meeting in Copenhagen. And this is what it looks like. I mean, there are thousands of people in the room, each of whom has an agenda. And their agenda is to represent the position of their country. Oh, we're doing the right thing because, and you're doing the wrong thing because. And all of these ways of where the carbon comes from is sort of inexact, right? For example, everybody's saying, well, it's all coming from China nowadays. But what's China doing? China's outsourced the manufacturing we used to do here. So is it really them that's emitting it, or is it us by buying all their little bits of plastic? So there's a lot of questions as to how you count when you get nations in a room. And so they spend a lot of time squabbling about should we count the past emissions? Should we not count the past emissions? That's the big one. Because if you count the past emissions, the United States emission budget is zero. We've used up our emission budget because we've been emitting a lot for a long time. So you just add it up in the bathtub way. Half that stuff in the bathtub already is ours. We don't get to do anymore. So the United States can't actually stop emitting carbon overnight. So how do you balance those things? They have these big meetings, they yell at each other, and they say, well, next year we'll work it out. And then there's this one. At parties, people ask you what you do. Well, I have a new story now, but until recently, if I didn't know who was at the party, I would mumble, I'm a geophysicist, and try to avoid discussing climate. Because people don't really know what to say. And there's this great story in the George Marshall's book. Meyer Hillman, a passionate climate change campaigner, was attending a dinner party with retired liberal professionals like himself. People were talking about their latest holiday trips, and he could not resist bringing up the issue of climate change and the impacts of their airline flights on future generations. The room went very quiet. Then a guest decided to break the ice. My word, she said, what a lovely spinach tart. Oh, yes, everyone agreed emphatically. It was a very lovely spinach tart. According to Meyer, they spent the next 10 minutes talking about the tart. So I'm going to try to end on an upbeat way, as is normally the case. And how to end a thing like this is actually a difficult problem. You don't want to demoralize people. You want to engage people. And yet the problem is really, really quite difficult. So if you only read one book on this subject, I would like to propose that you get this book called Climate Changed, which is actually an illustrated presentation. It's sort of a comic book. It's extremely tastefully drawn. It's by this French guy, Philippe Squarzoni. And it starts off really gentle. It spends many pages at the beginning describing beginning the project. Well, that makes sense. And so naturally I should have guessed, I didn't quite, is that the end of the book would be describing how to end the project. So he talks a lot about beginnings and endings in this book. And I'll get to his ending in a minute. But let's talk about the conventional ending. The conventional ending is you can do your part. You can walk more. You can insulate your house. You can fill your tires, and so on and so forth. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with these things. These are good things to do. Reducing your footprint is exactly what we're trying to do. But there's 7 billion of us. If a few hundred of us are treading more lightly, that doesn't change the overall fact that we're all herding through this field, trampling on it. And it's not your own footprint that you should care about. It's the footprint of the whole world. So I find this sort of an ending, which even Al Gore's movie, which is sort of the prototype for this sort of a talk, Al Gore's movie ended with, it's gloomy, 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 and then as the credits roll, it told you to change your light bulbs. Well, you definitely should change your light bulbs. I don't want to say anything bad about changing the light bulbs, but that's not the answer. Without collective acts, individual acts are futile. And the Internet is wonderful. These are the actual deck chairs on the Titanic. And a friend of mine I showed the slides to last night, he said, I gave a talk once and I used that same picture. We're talking about minor changes when we change our light bulb. We need to make major changes. We have to bring the carbon footprint of the world not down a little or not stop growing. We have to bring it to zero. We have to stop emitting carbon because it doesn't go away. And we're all in it together. If you decide to shrink your footprint and some country in Asia starts coming into money and starts increasing their footprint, you're not any better off. We all have the same consequences, and it's our descendants really that are going to have to deal with it. There are real limits to what we can do as individuals. If you're in a boat and the boat's leaking, and it's leaking because people are punching holes in the deck, you stopping punching holes in the deck will not prevent the boat from sinking. You have to change the culture of people who like punching holes in the deck. So the solution will involve everybody everywhere, and unfortunately, although people say, well, politics has failed, we'll have to do this some other way, I don't think there is any other way. There has to be politics. So this is what Squarzoni concluded. If I'm being honest with myself, I believe three things. One, there's a doorway we need to pass through. Technically, it's still possible to avoid the worst consequences of climate change and to take the necessary measures to manage the upheavals that are already inevitable. Two, the doorway is not very wide. It closes a little more each day, and we have only a little time to pass through it. Three, I do not think we will pick that door. Now, I have to say that there's a lot of plausibility to this. Given all the problems that we have, it's really quite likely that his conclusion 3 will be true. And in order to not leave you with that gloomy conclusion, I would like to point something else out to you. What we're doing is not our fate. What we are doing is our choice. We don't predict whether we're going to go shopping. Why should we predict whether we will go on emitting? It is something we decide. And essentially, if it's the real test of our species going forward. It's going to tell whether we thrive or whether we don't thrive. Is really going to hinge on whether we can really see this as a collective problem that involves everyone on Earth, not us against some enemy. And they shouldn't perceive us as their enemy, because you can't have a war on a ship, right? Well, you can have a mutiny, but you can't really have a war. The other upbeat thing I want to say is that Austin is going to be important in all of this. Texas is going to be important in all of this. We are at the center of the old energy world and at the center of the new energy world here. And energy is very, very crucial. So Texas is blessed with wind. Texas is blessed with solar. Texas is blessed with a lot of technical talent. These are things that we can make a positive contribution in. But there's another thing that I would like to point out about Austin, which is it's not just a place of technical innovation, it's a place of social innovation. And I couldn't really figure out, I just came to me this morning that this is how I should end it. So I had to come up with slides for social innovation, so I came up with South by Southwest parties and Eeyore's birthday. Whatever you feel about these two events, they're both very creative. And they're both not creative in a technical way so much as in a social way. And what we need to do is come up with a different way of thinking about the world and thinking about each other. And if it's going to happen, and it has to happen, Austin can play a big part in it.
Thank you for a very perceptive talk. It's really interesting. I know we'll have a lot of questions. Please raise your hands.
I'm excited. Dale and I are going to New York to the march. Whether we'll do any good, I don't know, but I got to try. I'm also involved in the CCL, Citizens Climate Lobby, trying to do things through that, and I'd like your comments on that. And also working on looking at all of our investments and divesting with oil products, carbon. Is that of any real value.
My belief about divestment is that, first of all, it's a sensible thing to do, because sooner or later, some of these materials are going to be left in the ground. So these companies are overvalued. So regardless of whether you're trying to put financial pressure on them or not, they can't be worth as much as they claim they are, because the value to us of their material is no longer a positive thing. It's actually negative. So I think divesting from fossil fuel companies, especially fossil fuel companies that aren't making any gesture to move into new forms of energy, is actually completely sensible from a financial point of view as well as an ethical point of view. Citizens Climate Lobby is, again, I'm not a political person, but in terms of getting the United States off the dime, seems like the very competent, very well thought out, and has just a ghost of a chance of appealing to both parties. So I totally support them. I went to one of the meetings. I decided I was sort of an odd duck. They didn't really want to talk science, but I totally support them. I think they're great. And as far as New York goes, I'm really thinking about it. I haven't decided yet whether I'm going, but I hope a lot of people show up.
I watched a film 2 weeks ago called Cowspiracy, and it was disturbing to say the least. And it looked at the global production of animals for consumption and the impacts. And when you add it up, I mean, there is no single activity that we're doing that creates more emissions, is causing more deforestation, causing dead zones in ocean. I mean, cumulatively, it is the most destructive thing we're doing, and yet none of the environmental groups are talking about it. And this code of silence. I mean, you want to quiet a room, talk at a party about not eating meat, especially if they're serving it, and yet this is something we can actively do. I mean, I believe this is one of the personal choices that we can make, and build up. I'm now committed to building up the whole plant-based protein alternative. I just see that as the only way. I don't think we can fight the meat industry, but I think we need to build the alternative. My question to you is what I think, in Austin, I'm working on the climate steering committee, and was talking to the chair last week and said, what can we ask people to do that will actually make a difference? And locally, limiting single occupancy vehicle trips. Avoiding the trips altogether, carpooling, busing, biking, walking, whatever. I mean, it's got to be one of them. I think one of the other ones is asking people to cut back on the amount of animal products they eat. And I'm looking at this personally myself. I've been vegetarian for years, but my family eats a lot of dairy products, and they are not much less destructive than the others. So, on top of those, what we want to do something. What would you ask the steering committee of Austin, who's leading? I mean, I'm working on trying to make sure that the elected officials have green, sort of leanings. But what can we ask the citizens and therefore the candidates and the people leading Austin, if Austin's supposed to be leading the planet? What can we ask them to do?
Okay. I'm going to come at this from a really odd angle. I'm going to say the best thing you can do is quit your day job. I become nearly totally vegan since I quit my day job. I've lost about 40 pounds. So it's been really good for me. I also want to say that it's true that meat has a huge impact on greenhouse gases. I was actually next door to the two people who did the first actual geophysical study of that at the University of Chicago. Neither of them got tenure because it wasn't geophysics, really. The department really didn't like it. Science is all, But whether it's the largest impact or not, again, it's really hard to count these things, what you attribute to what. But animal products are a significant factor. Beef and dairy are especially so because these are ruminant animals, and if they're lot-fed as opposed to grass-fed, you're essentially growing grass to make methane. And methane is another greenhouse gas. So they have the double hit. Not only is there all the costs of producing extra calories for these animals, but also that they emit methane. And that's particularly cows, also anything that eats grass, but especially cows, which eat the most. So yeah, that's all true. But your other question is, how do we affect the city? I don't think we can tell them to shut down Franklin's. I mean, this is Austin, right? You can't not barbecue here. It would be madness to not have somewhere in the world where that tradition is carried on. So, and this is the place to do it. So it's kind of, I don't like to see people punishing themselves. I would like us to see ways to move into the future that are fun and positive and great. So grass-fed beef. Don't grow crops to feed your beef. Your prices are going to go way up, but you'll still be able to have beef a couple times a year. That's my position on that one. And I don't think that's a place you want to approach the city, because Austin's prosperity is, Texas's prosperity is based on oil and beef. You don't want to take them both on at the same time.
Thanks for interesting and sobering talk. When it comes to trying to do things, I understand that this church is about to go through some renovations. What would be your specific thoughts about how this church could exemplify cutting down on carbon and making a model of beauty as well as saving the planet?
That's a hard one. I wish I could call the quote up to mind that I was trying to pass around when we started talking about this, from Frank Lloyd Wright, which is basically to think of nature as your ally. And so, in terms of the nuts and bolts, and which kind of glass to use and which kind of ceiling tiles to use and all that stuff, I'm no expert on that stuff. But I think we can make spaces that celebrate nature rather than step on it. And I would hope that First UU would not only be technically sound when it rebuilds, but also have a nature aesthetic. That's what I have to say about that.
The fossil fuel industry is perhaps the only industry that does not have to pay for its pollution. It would seem to me that if a carbon tax could be imposed, this problem would solve itself probably within a generation as far as reducing consumption. As long as they can continue to emit poison into the atmosphere and pay nothing for it, no other company can do that. The talk of a carbon neutral or a revenue neutral carbon tax is what's being proposed now, where all the revenue would be given back to individuals in a monthly refund check. What are your thoughts on a revenue neutral carbon tax to help us move this in a way that will not involve bureaucracy, but will more or less involve the market system that we praise so much?
People are asking me all sorts of questions that are just at the fringes of what I know rather than at the core of what I know, but I'm perfectly willing to tell you what I think. I think that's the right approach for the United States. I think there are other approaches that make sense, but in terms of the political constellation we have now, that's certainly the best approach to getting the United States down to carbon neutrality, is just a simple tax. The drawback is that the people who get hit the hardest are essentially the less well-off people in rural areas, who tend to be the people who are sort of the most suspicious and hostile to collective action in the first place. And you're just going to make them even more hopping mad. And so that's the other side of it. The intellectual wing of the Republican Party sees this as a perfectly sensible approach, but the grassroots probably won't. and that's the real drawback. First of all, it hurts them, and second, it riles them up in the place they're already riled up. So that's the drawback to it.
Hi, thank you for your talk. You mentioned the uncertainties that get injected into these issues. It's indisputable the planet is getting hotter, but some people say, well, this is just a natural cycle versus something due to human activity. What's your take on that?
I was careful in what I presented to stay away from things that are scientifically controversial. There is a ton of science out there. There's a ton of arguments. The things I presented to you, except for that fuzzy thing at the end where I showed you how fuzzy it was, are absolutely very solid. Scientists don't like to talk about certainty because that's not their philosophy. But it's pretty much for sure that you can't add carbon dioxide to the system without changing it, and that the amount of carbon dioxide that we're adding is enough to make a big difference, and that it's piling up faster and faster. Those facts are facts. And for somebody to say that those are in dispute, well, basically, for one reason or another, they're wrong.
If you do have a question, raise your hand, and we will try to get around to everybody who has a question. We have about 10 minutes, I think.
You seem to have sort of a party animal aspect to you. So I'd like to know what kinds of fun ways would you suggest that we get the community more involved in public transportation, taking public transportation, rather than relying on cars?
You've given me a bigger opening than you think. My vision of the future is elevated bike routes everywhere and electric trains running on the same elevated structure. So leave the roads on the surface, build up a whole nother layer, and that layer is going to be beautiful. I have this whole long song dance. It'd be very expensive, but I'm totally in favor of off-road bike trails. I think Austin is doing an excellent job of that. Motorized transportation, though, is a lot harder, right? Because it involves a huge amount of money. And getting it wrong is a big risk. And I think at-grade motorized transportation, whether it's buses or trains, does reduce our carbon footprint, but it doesn't reduce our traffic. It actually makes the traffic worse. And that also increases our carbon footprint because we're spending our time idling, unless you have a Prius. I don't know how to make buses fun. Trains are fun. Bikes are fun. Streetcars, buses, I think they're a compromise, and I think they're a good thing, and I would support them. But I like your question, and I think that the problem with them is that nobody says, oh boy, let's go for a ride in a bus. And I don't think they will. I mean, I actually, there was one bus route in Madison where people liked to ride it. It was like a rolling party. So, I got nothing to do. Let's just take the number 5 downtown. And they would take it downtown, go around the square, and come back up. And they wouldn't get off the bus. So there was actually a party bus in Madison for a while. But that's not really scalable. And so, yeah, I don't have an answer for at-grade transportation being fun. I wish I did. But I love off-road bike paths. There are lots of opportunities around Austin by the various, so-called brooks, which are really drainage ditches at this point. You could run bike paths all through this town, and they've started and it's really wonderful, and I use them.
Hi. Earlier in your talk, you mentioned the potential future problems of
food and water shortages, and particularly about displaced populations, refugees. Are we already starting to see that globally in various areas where away from flooded seacoasts or desert areas or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. These are fuzzy questions, right? If somebody leaves their house, it's not because the climate changed. It's because their living circumstances are not workable. And they may not see it as a climate change thing, but if you move into a house and it's at sea level and it floods a lot, you move into a house that floods a lot. You don't move into a climate change situation. So you eventually say, oh, this house is falling down, I'm out of here. So it's hard to really identify it yet. There has been a case, this was kind of a sort of a breakthrough, somebody moving from a Pacific island in New Zealand got refugee status partly on the basis that the island was sinking. So that's the first legal recognition of anybody being a climate refugee, and it's happened in one case. So it's really hard to say. On the other hand, took a drive on the back roads around Junction, Texas, and there's all these historical plaques about range wars, people fighting over cattle, and you look around you and there's nothing, right? So that area doesn't support cattle anymore, and 100 years ago it did. So you can say that people moved out of that part of West Texas because it dried up. I mean, I don't think there's any other way you can explain how people were fighting so vigorously over these properties that are now deserted. So, yeah, people move around, and I don't think anyone left Junction because they were a climate refugee. They just left Junction because I can't make it in the cattle business around here. So because it's slow compared to human timescales, it's not easy to perceive that happening. But I think it's already happening.
Time for one, maybe two more questions, if anybody has another question. Okay.
Dr. Tobis, I'm hoping that you might speak to the science way out of the problems that you've been describing. I'm hoping you might speak to the possibility of scientific fixes to this problem in the future, with the possibility that people aren't going to change what they do. We're going to keep business as usual. So there are science fixes of perhaps geoengineering, and also like a miracle way to make energy, because we keep using more and more energy. A better way to do it.
That's another really great question. I think, in fact, that's an idea for an entire talk, if not an entire book, if not an entire career. So there are a lot of questions about how we can cope even if we don't deal with the carbon problem some other way. I think the important answer is, since I don't have time to go through all of that, the important thing to say here in this situation is for me to say, if you find yourself in a hole, you should stop digging. So that curve, if we don't do anything, takes off really fast. And whatever solutions we come up with get harder and harder and harder. So it's kind of taking your eye off the ball to talk about those things too much. We're going to need them. We're going to need a lot of them, and I'm very interested in them. And I'm starting to write a book on the idea of drawing the carbon down. But that's going to take a very long time to do successfully. Maybe we'll come up with something brilliant. I don't know. Technical solutions are wonderful, but the fact is that we're making the problem more challenging with every passing year. So my answer to you is, yeah, there's a lot of that stuff, and I love to talk about it. I'm very interested in it. But for our present purposes, I would say if you're in a hole, you stop digging.
I know that we are at a population of maybe, is it 7 billion and headed towards 10 billion? And certainly population must be part of the issue of energy use and climate change. Do you have any thoughts on that? We just have a little bit of time left.
Yeah, population going up doesn't help matters. But if you actually look at where the population is increasing, it's mostly increasing in very poor countries. Most countries have moved towards what they call a demographic transition. Now, it gets really complicated. We don't want them to stay poor. We want them to get more like us so that they're not miserable and not, let's face it, angry. But on the other hand, if there's an Ethiopian child or an American child, the American child is literally going to do 50 times as much damage. So it's really the carbon footprint we're talking about. If these countries develop directly into the wind and solar and non-carbon economy, then they won't be the problem. We'll still be the problem. We have all this established structure. We have all these amazing highway interchanges that we spend so much money on. They're not much good if we stop driving cars around. They don't have those, so they might find some other way of getting around. So the population problem is real. We need to find food for everybody. If we stopped depending too much, rich people stopped eating meat, there would be plenty of grain for poor people. We're not running into a food crisis, except for the fact that more people are coming online with enough money to demand meat, and that's taking the food out of off the plates of the poorest people. So I think when it comes down to it, you're more talking about, when you start thinking about the population problem, you quickly turn into the international equity problem and away from the population problem. We don't think the population will continue to expand beyond 10 billion. That's what the demographic people are saying, is that it's starting to top off. So these days people don't talk that much about the problem, but it's not because they're avoiding it. It's because they think that's not really the problem.
Today.